Right, you lot, less chattering, form a group over there, and open your books at page 49.
Exactly how do we do that?
Well, just stroke the spine, of course.
Don't be such a wimp, Longbottom.
In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, the half-giant Hagrid, the instructor for the care of magical creatures, assigns the students the Monster Book of Monsters as a textbook. This fuzzy book has a literal bite and attacks the students when they try to access its contents. As Hagrid points out, you have to rub the spine to calm it down so you can open it and read it. The novelty of a monster book that is itself an actual monster is clever and entertaining. And in 2023, an unusual book on the Bible and monsters was released that delighted many and terrorized a few others with its content. I found out about it at a conference I attended last fall. It was the end of my presentation at the American Academy of Religion, and people were milling around talking about the reception that concluded our panel. I was packing up my laptop when a woman greeted me and told me her publisher was making her hand out little cards to promote her book. She handed me one of the cards advertising her work, God's Monsters, Vengeful Spirits, Deadly Angels, Hybrid Creatures, and Divine Hitmen of the Bible. The woman was Dr. Esther Hamori, professor of Hebrew Bible at Union Theological Seminary in New York, and her book was to have its own dedicated panel discussion the following day. I attended the panel, and while it was good, I hadn't had the chance to read the book. To my chagrin, the book had sold out not only at the conference but on Amazon. I had to wait weeks before obtaining my copy. I couldn't wait to see what monsters the book would discuss and if they were ones I hadn't seen before in the text. I also wondered how the author would challenge people's general view of the Bible. After weeks of waiting with these and other questions, I got my copy. Hamori opens the book by stating, quote, "Every culture has its monster lore, and the world behind the Bible is no exception," end quote. The stated purpose of Hamori's work is to desentimentalize the biblical interpretations well-meaning believers often make. For example, God as a gentle, white-bearded buddy who always handles humanity as tenderly as a PETA activist would handle a baby kitten, and who employs a host of cheerful, rosy-cheeked baby angels and pampers who spend their days sprinkling good feelings on people. Hamori writes, quote, "The Bible has been domesticated, along with the eerie creatures within. Monsters of the Bible can indeed demonstrate something about the nature of the biblical God. But be prepared, God's nature isn't always so benevolent. In fact, this God may be the monster of monsters," end quote. For those coming from an Adventist perspective, a book that draws heavily on the historical critical approach can be challenging. However, this doesn't mean that having our views of inspiration or picture of God challenged is a bad thing. It's a chance not only to understand how others outside of a historical grammatical approach the Bible, but also to wrestle with our unexamined assumptions about the Bible. To only engage in scholarship that agrees with my own presuppositions about a text creates an unhelpful echo chamber as well as theological blind spots. Hamori organizes her book in 3 sections: God's Entourage, which looks at creatures like angels, the monsters beneath, which includes things like Leviathan, ghosts, and giants, and finally, the God Monster, which looks at God himself. Reactions to Hamori's book have ranged from enthusiastic praise and excellent sales numbers to acknowledgement of its importance with caveats related to what some see as being inconsistent with how she takes on face value certain texts as being literally true descriptions about God, while in other places admitting that the text is just the product of human origin. This is where some faith traditions might part ways with Hamori as they hold the Bible to be entirely inspired. And finally, to some who claim that it is the most ungracious reading of the text they've ever seen, noting Hamori's provocative and playful style, particularly when it comes to labeling God things like a mob boss, a gaslighter, and even an abuser. There is so much this book brings to the table and so many important questions it raises that it's impossible to cover everything. However, we can scratch the surface and scare up some important insights. To help me with this, I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. Brandon Grafius to Beast and Bible. Brandon joined us last season when we explored the biblical slasher of Judges 19. Dr. Grafius is Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible at Ecumenical Theological Seminary in Detroit, Michigan. He has published widely on the intersection between horror and religion. His book, Lurking Under the Surface, Horror, Religion, and the Questions That Haunt Us, was an amazing book that came out in 2022 from Broadleaf Books. He is currently co-editing the Oxford Handbook of Biblical Monsters, and Brandon was a member of the American Academy of Religion panel that discussed Hamori's work. I am so excited he's back with us. I'm calling this episode The Monster Book of Monsters. I'm Dr. Seth Pierce, and welcome to Beast and Bible. Brandon, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and hanging out today.
Thanks so much for having me, Seth. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so let's talk about Dr. Hamori's book. As I mentioned to our listeners in the intro, I got a huge privilege to meet her at American Academy of Religion last year and had a really fun time hanging out at the reception after our Monster Symposium, Monster Studies panel. Yeah, super nice, very gracious, and got the book, which was so popular, sold out at the conference, sold out on Amazon. Finally got my copy, read through it, and so much to enjoy and so much to be really challenging going through the book. And just a little bit of your background, kind of, how did you pick up the book? Because I know at the conference you were on a panel discussion discussing her work. Just a little bit of context, how did you get acquainted with Dr. Hamori and her work?
Sure. So I've done monster theory and horror theory more broadly in my work as a biblical scholar for going on a decade or so now. My dissertation was called Reading Phineas, Watching Slashers, looking at Phineas in Numbers 25 as a slasher figure. And while this is the first time Dr. Hamori has worked specifically with monster theory, she's always kind of circled around these themes in her text. Her previous book on women's divination had a lot of work with the ghost of Samuel and ghosts and spirits and necromancers in general in the Hebrew Bible. So she and I have had some email exchanges, talked about our work and things like that. When it was announced there was a panel at AAR that was going to be talking about her book, I got invited to be one of the respondents for it. So I got an advanced copy of the book to be able to look ahead and develop something somewhat coherent to say about it at this fantastic panel, this great symposium that happened at the AAR conference.
Yeah, it was great. I felt so privileged to be able to sit there and just listen to everyone kind of digest the text and ask good questions. And yeah, always a good time. So getting right into it, one of the strengths of the book is sort of in her thesis. She really sets out to demonstrate just how much we have sentimentalized the Bible and faith, not just the Christian faith, but anyone who looks at the Bible as a sacred text. Yeah. And I think her case is strong in many cases, but I really find it being strongest when she's discussing like the cherubim and seraphim and angels in general, just because of how we've, my mind always goes to like Precious Moments dolls and some of the paintings that we do, of angels that are very gentle, sentimental. And
then if you grew up in the 1980s, you've got Highway to Heaven as kind of one of your touchstones, and
Touched by an Angel, all those kind of things. So in what ways have you seen sentimentalizing at work personally and professionally? And then kind of a follow-up, is that always a bad thing?
I think those are both really fascinating questions to explore. I'm always hesitant to answer anything with always.
Yep.
So I do kind of resist that. I've been around the church all my life as a church member. I grew up in the United Church of Christ tradition, and now I teach at a seminary where most of the students, they're not looking to go on in academia, they're looking to be pastors or chaplains or things like that. So I have had lots of conversations with people about questions of faith, about how they relate to all of these things. Many people, when they first found I was going to seminary and I was studying the Old Testament, the response was something like, that's just so violent.
Yeah.
We want to go straight to Jesus. So I think for Christians, there's a lot of sentimentalizing of the New Testament in particular, because it can be a really nasty place too. And, it ends with lakes of fire and sinners being cast into, all sorts of ugliness.
All the apocalyptic imagery.
And that's not just a footnote at the end of the Bible here. That's the culmination of where the entire New Testament is going towards. So I think we do, from my own corner of the Christian tradition, at least, we really sentimentalize the New Testament. And then I think in some ways we tend to, what would we say, have this really negative reaction to the Old Testament, where we read Psalm 23 and, one line from Psalm 22 and a couple other passages we like, but generally want to get rid of that so we can get straight to the New Testament.
Yeah, I resonate with that a lot and watch people grappling with those things. And I like how you pointed out that the New Testament is sort of seen as an escape from the Hebrew scriptures, like, got to get to Jesus, get to the Gospels, and not just, which is absolutely correct when we look at, Revelation and a lot of the apocalyptic imagery and violent imagery that we see there. But you've got stories like Ananias and Sapphira, people just dropping dead, when they make the spirit mad. I mean, there's some really challenging stories going on in there. We tend to just sort of skip over those or pretend they're not there.
But what that does for us is that we skip over the challenging, darker parts of our own faith, and then we hone in on those parts in other people's faiths. So it allows us to have this perspective that the Quran is a really violent text, but the God in the New Testament is all about love. that's not an accurate reading of either of those books.
Yeah, no, totally unnuanced and unfair representations. And then, just nuancing my own question a little bit, instead of saying, is it always a bad thing? Is there value to sentimentalizing? Is there ever a space where that's helpful?
Yeah, I think I want to start with the caution of against that, and then maybe move towards how it can be helpful. I think the caution is I've seen a number of people of faith who are really surprised to find that there are violent passages in the New Testament, or really dig into what it means that there's violence in the Hebrew Bible. And if you haven't thought through it, and your faith is this kind of overly sentimentalized faith, that can be really challenging, maybe more challenging than you have the tools to be able to deal with. And it easily can lead to just frustration and either giving up just on interpreting these parts of our traditions, or in some cases, I've seen people give up on religion entirely because they come to these texts from a sentimental perspective and aren't prepared for the challenges that really exist in our religious traditions. However,
yes,
I do think that there is a caution of focusing entirely on the violent, the negative aspects, to the point that you can overlook all of the good things in the text. And if that's what we mean by sentimentalizing, if we say, well, let's make sure we spend some time with the loving God that exists in both the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament, and not focus too much on the angry, wrathful aspect of God. I think there can be a healthy balance that people can find there.
That's good. Pivoting a little bit, I think the one thing, and you've probably gotten this too, and I've gotten this not just as someone who's in academia, but as someone who's a local Christian pastor too, there's eyebrows raised. Are you studying monsters in religion? Why would you do that? What's wrong with you? And you have to feel like I have to tell people, like, this is an area that I study and an area that I'm developing specialty in, but it doesn't mean I'm like a Marilyn Manson type figure. I'm not sadistic. I don't, and there's a lot of backpedaling that has to happen. And then often what ends up happening, at least for my tradition, which is Adventist, is I can simply ask the question, what sort of imagery do we put on our evangelistic flyers, which are rooted in the books of Daniel and Revelation? And it's sort of like a light bulb goes on, like, oh yeah, we do have some monsters going on. So how has this book made a strong case for the relevance of monster and religion studies, generally speaking in academia, but particularly for communities of faith?
For communities of faith, I've done a lot of wrestling with why our text is the way our text is. Clearly, the biblical writers, whatever you believe about the level of inspiration or the nature of that inspiration that happened to produce the text that we have, it could have followed a process where everything was sunshine and rainbows and puppy dogs, and we had happy stories of treating each other nicely, and everybody was happy throughout the book. And that's not the book we have. So that kind of forces me to step back and say, so why do we have the book the way it is? And I think there are lots of answers to that. One of them is that it's a book that is rooted in history. It is about the history of the people. It's not just about God. It's about the people working through their ideas of God within history. And as soon as you enter history into the equation, you have to admit that history is not that sunshine and rainbows vision that we maybe wish it was. So I think the writers of the Bible were inspired enough or smart enough or wise enough, some combination of all three, to recognize that if we're going to make a book that talks about God and the totality of life, we got to have everything in there.
Yeah, I agree. It's, and I've seen, even just from a reading conservative apologist from a Christian perspective, even something they'll bring out is, if you had a book that was full of gumdrops, and puppy dogs and everything, and nothing bad ever happened, you'd sort of question the validity of it, saying, is this really anything historical? This doesn't seem, and the fact that it's unflinching and it's recording of truly horrific, moments. You mentioned one of Dr. Hamori's previous works looking at women in divinization and I'm blanking on the name of the book, but I read that not too long ago, and just her brief mentioning of like these cannibal mothers, in the Hebrew scripture, like I totally forgot about that story. I totally, maybe I blocked it out, but then it makes me go back and think, there's no shying away from these kinds of things. But I think not necessarily always that extreme, but anyone who's lived life long enough realizes that there are some really difficult, traumatic moments that if you live long enough, you're going to go through some variation of them. And having a book that includes that is validating. Number one, that you're not some outlier having this experience where true believers, have happiness all the time. And then there's ways, I think, to find hope, even if it's just solidarity and saying, okay, maybe there's some tools here that can help me process my own dark seasons and challenges. So So just kind of a general question here. There's so much to talk about. You could never do this book justice. But what was your favorite part, or a couple favorite parts, going through the book that really just stood out? Like, I'm highlighting that section and coming back to it.
Yeah. So for me, the showstopper is the final chapter of God is Monster. I felt pretty proud to get a footnote in that section of the book because it's something I've wrestled with too. I wrote a chapter in a book a few years ago called Reading the Bible with Horror, where I was looking at all the ways that God uses the weapons of chaos. And it's
great book, by the way. We'll put that in the show notes.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And really, I think is described in the same kinds of terms as these ancient Near East chaos monsters are described. And I think Homori does some really interesting things with that idea in her final chapter. It's probably where she gets the most theological, so to speak. And I admired that. I felt like that was a section where sometimes the book is so intently focused on its historical critical work that she doesn't really allow herself to step away from the text. And I liked it when she was able to take a slightly bigger view and talk about it in those kinds of terms in that last chapter.
Yeah, no, that was good. I like that one as well. And I kind of alluded to this at the beginning. And, I've heard things, usually we go to Ezekiel, when we talk about the biblically accurate angels full of eyes and wings. But I love to work with the cherubim and the seraphim and really digging into those. And fascinating concepts. And just so much in there. The book is full of a lot of various pop culture references, which brings up what I've seen as a shift, at least in communication studies, which is sort of where my, I've got a theology background, but also communication. And I know pop culture is getting more and more academic street cred. If you're looking at subjects like intercultural communication, there's more and more sections on popular culture as vehicles for ideology and different things like that. But, going around AAR last year and looking at some of the presentations on video games, looking at the pop culture panel, there seems to be, in my opinion, a positive shift to allow more serious exploration of pop culture. How are you feeling about that? I know you kind of work in that area too. Why are pop culture and fandoms important in the context of religious studies?
There certainly have been an explosion in development, not just in Bible and horror, but as you say, all kinds of popular culture. So I tend to hang out on the Society of Biblical Literature side instead of the AAR side. I'm on the steering committee for the Bible and Film unit, where we have some presentations that are like, let's talk about, Pasolini's Jesus movie. And I think those are interesting. But what I'm really interested in is, let's talk about how the Evil Dead as body horror connects with the vision of the body that we have in the Priestley text, where we can really see how these same kinds of thoughts are being worked out different ways, but with some overlap that is really productive to talk about. So I really love all those spaces opening up. It's really happened in the last 15 years or so. I think Homori's work is kind of an interesting hybrid, so to speak, as we're in monstrous language, in that she really does come from an historical critical background. And her primary interest is in reading the text. So it seems like her primary interest in pop culture is using these references as a way to elucidate or help explain some of the things she's seeing in the Bible. She's not really interested in that kind of two-way dialogue. That's the thing that really drives the work that I do. Definitely a stronger historical critical scholar than I'll ever be, but the work that we try to do is really different. And I think that's one of the things that I feel like some readers have kind of misread her book as being a book about the Bible and popular culture. I don't think it is. Yeah. I think it's about the Bible, and then she brings in pop culture almost as ornamentation. I think if you stripped away the pop culture references, the meat of the book would still be there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It was interesting too, and maybe this is a marketing choice. It kind of comes out, God's monsters and some of the, before I had a chance to read the book, you kind of felt like, okay, maybe this is going to be more in that pop culture space. But I totally agree with you. Like if you were to take out the references as ornamentation, or even just like building, metaphors to illustrate something, you'd still have, it really wouldn't affect, any of the arguments at all. With pop culture, pivoting a little bit, you work at a seminary, and having gone through a seminary experience myself, there is tension, I think, and part of it depends on the seminary and the faith tradition, between sort of the sacred text and the sacred things of the faith and sort of crass, secular, in quotes, pop culture. How, as you're talking to your students who are training for ministry, what are some healthy ways for them to say, all right, pop culture is a thing, it's pervasive, it's influential. It doesn't necessarily mean my church is going to be excited about it, but what are some ways, I think, from a ministry standpoint and even just a faith standpoint, we can have a healthy dialogue with a popular culture around us?
I think one of the basic ideas that is really eye-opening for my students is just the idea that there isn't this hard line between the sacred and the secular that we like to think there is, that the Bible bleeds into all kinds of aspects of our popular culture, our movies, our books, our songs. I've got an edited volume coming out on the Bible and horror comics. Should be out later this year or early next year. And the more we can pay attention to those, the more we understand how people are interpreting the Bible. One of my favorite scholars of religion and pop culture, Doug Cowan, saw him at a conference a couple of years ago where he said, he was talking about his new book, America's Dark Theologian, that's on Stephen King and theology. And he was talking about a theologian might publish an article in Theology Today. Nobody will read it. You're not going to go hang out with your friends and say, hey, did you read this new article in Theology Today? Even by someone like N.T. Wright, you're not going to go talk about that at the bar. You will say, did you read this new book by Stephen King? And if you're able to pay attention to things like how Pet Sematary reflects sacred space and how it demonstrates guides who bring us into these traditions of rituals, you're able to not only look at Pet Sematary in a deeper way, but look at how our religious traditions are influencing everything around us and how the wider culture is interpreting them, which I think is enormously valuable.
Yeah. We just had Eric Harrelson and Joseph Laycock on the podcast to talk about their new book, The Exorcist Effect. And one of the elements that came through very clearly is their idea of the Exorcist Effect and how pop culture, whether people are watching movies or not, really, or reading things or not, they become part of the cultural imagination, our imagery, our conversations. And so often, in many cases, people of faith are even wandering around with a script they've picked up from a movie, but functioning as though it's sort of classical theology or even something from the Bible when it's not.
Very much.
And this brings up an issue, and this, we didn't, maybe I haven't talked about this before, so I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm curious, when you, as a Bible scholar, are looking at the text, and maybe we can read it a little bit later when we talk about Lilith, which comes up very briefly in Hamori's work. Do you see Bible writers drawing on the popular culture of their day, in the Bible text to make points?
I think that's a really fascinating question. And I think absolutely. The popular culture of their day would have obviously looked very different from the popular culture we have today. But you see things like how the Hebrew Bible writers are in dialogue with the other myths and traditions of the cultures around them. That Genesis 1 is really a rewriting of Babylonian and other kinds of creation myths, where you've got, in many of these myths, you have this battle between God and the chaos monsters that is the founding event of creation. And here in Genesis, that is reimagined to where we have a God who's so powerful that God can divide without having to fight anything. So you respond to that by kind of taking the battle out and making an argument that this God we're depicting is so powerful that God doesn't even have to fight. It's clearly a comment on those. And I think we see the Bible doing that all the time.
Yeah. And I think that's an error that I don't want to single anybody out or label somebody immature, but there is this idea, I think, initially, and whether it's, growing up in a religious community or family or coming into it and being excited and new, sort of, whether you would articulate it or not, it's this idea that this book, the sacred text, just kind of fell off a cloud and we just had it, and it has nothing to do with the world around it, and I'm not even commenting on the inspiration of sacred texts. I don't think it necessarily affects that. I think you can say, these people are in a context, and as you mentioned in the case of Genesis, they're casting a new vision, for God, the God that they're writing about, and it's over against what may be surrounding them. It's not just something they came up with ex nihilo, we're like, we're just going to throw this out there. But there is language and dialogue and imagery, even Jesus drawing on certain traditions. I've heard, that the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, a retelling of a different source. So it's a familiar parable that he takes, but he kind of puts a twist on it, and so, these people aren't functioning in a vacuum.
I love that idea that then we, though, have this vision of the Bible as just kind of descending from the clouds. Steve Wiggins had a recent book where he talked about the Bible as a text of horror, has been hidden in plain sight for thousands of years, and we've refused to acknowledge it because we assume it has come from the clouds, so it can't have these kinds of negative genre associations like horror. Horror can't be in there because that's not the kind of book the Bible is, because we've decided that's not the kind of book the Bible is.
I've been doing some reading even on the story in the Gospels where they believe Jesus is a ghost. There's one piece of research that suggests that Mark is drawing on an ancient format of ghost story. He's changing it. There's definitely some, but there's different, if you want to call it sort of the metaphysics of ghosts that would be popular to his day. He's using it in the story, but he's turning it on its head. And so the idea that he would know about that he's operating within ancient literary traditions, is really interesting to me. Again, it's not just something that people are making up in a vacuum, but they're in dialogue with the world around them.
And I think the biblical writers were savvy enough to realize this is how you communicate with people. You use the genres, the formats, the kinds of stories that they know. Use those to tell your own truth.
Yeah. So one fascinating area when we get into the Hebrew in Homori's work talks about demons present in places like Psalms and how English kind of cloaks those. Again, right up there with the Gospels, I think the book of Psalms is probably one of the more read books in the Bible. And for most English translations, you wouldn't pick up necessarily any sort of names of demons, but you do have words like pestilence, death, plague. And so I'm wondering, if you would comment on that a little bit as far as how things like pestilence, death, and plague that we see in English is just sort of things are actually might be understood as entities, in the ancient writers' minds.
That was a place in Homori's book where I learned quite a lot. That wasn't something I'd studied before, but as soon as she said it, it made a lot of sense that so much of the worldview of the ancient Near East at that time was that the reasoning behind these, or the causation behind these kinds of bad events, is some demonic entity that's making you sick, that's causing this bad thing to happen. And it, to me, speaks to that human need to have a cause behind things. It feels a lot better to posit this evil being behind things than to say it's all just random and sometimes you don't feel well or sometimes you get sick and die. If we can find some reason for that makes sense, we can work with that.
Yeah. No, and this kind of gets into the next section, some of the challenges of the book. I know one dynamic, and I've marked up that section on Psalms, to come back and read later. I have so many questions, and of course, no author in the span of a single book, you can't answer all those questions. And that's one of the values, I think, of Homori's work is it raises questions that provoke further study, which is really valuable to me. So, but thinking about, how often the Bible, depending on the translation you're reading, an evil spirit was sent from God. God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And also, you kind of have the picture of God as sending out good and evil at the same time. And it raises questions about, is that God? Is that something about the ancient worldview? What is happening? And really, I think this is a place to start discussing this reality where when you're reading Homori's book, it doesn't take long to realize the author does not have a rosy picture of God and deploys language like God is a mob boss, a wife beater, a gaslighter, all these different things to describe a deity many devote themselves to. And so in some ways, and I don't mean this to sound snarky, but it sort of gave me a little bit of flashback in moments to like early Richard Dawkins, writings, God's a moral monster, the worst character, and I kind of got that vibe. And for a lot of readers, I think particularly those who might be thinking it's sort of a general Bible study, they may pick this book up. That might be a turnoff, and thinking, okay, this is really aggressively attacking a being I devote myself to. So one challenge that I have noted in public scholarship is you have to navigate between specialist language and, historically, this has changed a little bit, I think, emotionally detached tones and using imagery and feelings that are going to resonate with readers outside of the academy. And so how do you feel this book navigates those dynamics? Do you think the language in the book functions more like kind of a rallying cry to those who might take a really strong historical critical perspective, like Bart Ehrman, who endorses the book? Is it sort of like a rallying cry? I know in rhetorical studies, we talk about Weaver's God and devil terms. There's certain terms you use without a lot of explanation just to kind of rile people up to your side and drive a wedge. Or do you think she's just sticking to the purpose of the book, which is I'm here to kind of deconstruct and desentimentalize your faith and really shake you up? How do you feel like she navigates the language in the book?
I think one of the things she's really trying to do is have fun with this, is make dry, boring, historical, critical, biblical scholarship fun for people who wouldn't normally read this kind of stuff. And so I think she's being a little cheeky when she says God is a mob boss or God's a wife beater or anything like that. I feel like most of the time, and I'd have to go back through and pay more attention to whether she does this all the time. But I think most of the time she's careful to say, this is how this one specific text or this group of texts is describing God.
Yeah.
And that's really different than Richard Dawkins, who's trying to say, well, see, we have all these pictures of God here that make him a terrible person, and this is why you shouldn't ever worship this God, because just look at what he's like in the Bible.
Right.
I think Hamori is trying to say, look, the picture we have inherited from our tradition is much more complicated, nuanced, troubling, unsettling than we often allow ourselves to think. And that's a message we hear from the pulpit fairly frequently, that God can't be domesticated. God is not somebody who is at your beck and call to answer your prayers when you need a parking spot. I think it was Paul Tillich who said something to the effect of the easiest heresy to fall into is mistaking God for your idea of God, which I think is really profound, that we have these ideas of what God are, and we think that must be what God really is like. And a lot of what Hamori is trying to do in this book is say, let's really look at the full biblical picture so we can expand that idea of God. In some ways, maybe it's a 21st century version of that 1960s book, Your God is Too Small. Is that Phillips, I think? I remember my parents' generation loved that book, this idea that we think of God as police officer, as Santa Claus, or all these reductive images of God that we have. And we narrow God down to this small group of functions that we want God to perform.
Right.
And one of the things the biblical text does, and that Hamori really shines a light on, is say whatever you think God is bigger than that. God is different than that. God escapes your definition. When Moses tries to say to God, who are you? God really responds with a tautology of I am what I am, which I take to mean whatever you think I am, it's incomplete, if not wrong.
Yeah. It's interesting. I remember once just doing a cursory study of all the metaphors God uses in the Bible to describe himself. And you end up with everything from mother hens to lions to, all kinds of, images. And you if you list them all out, you're like, man, like this is all over the place. Some of these aren't closely related, which I think cumulatively gives that idea. This is a being that, certainly has chosen to reveal himself in scripture. And at the same time, within that revelation is otherness and wildness and, as Hamori points out, dangerousness.
Yeah.
Often because of constant exposure and proof texting, we can forget that the Bible is a sacred text that contains strange, wonderful, and even scary things. People of faith need to remember that its holiness isn't just related to goodness, but its otherness. It confronts us with conflicts, supernatural creatures, and divine interventions that can seem rather diabolical. Hamori approaches the text from a historical critical perspective, which, for some Christian faith traditions, is a monster in and of itself. For those traditions, it is a method that strips the text of its inspiration and views it strictly as a human creation, which leaves room for the scholar to interpret the text based on whatever whims resonate with an audience. However, those in a fundamentalist and errant camp that see every word as dictated by God can wind up with harmful interpretations that suit the needs of moralpreneurs, cultish leaders, and nationalist movements, just to name a few. There are a lot of believers who have sort of adopted a middle ground, recognizing that God inspired people to record events from their position in life and their perspective using their language, which tells us something about us as human beings, and at the same time they see God revealing pictures about himself and who ultimately has a good plan for humanity despite the challenges of working with us. Hamori's book gives us a good challenge in how we think about the composition of the text and how we interpret it. She challenges us by saying, quote, if we want to understand the Bible, we can't just take the merciful portrayals and gloss over the monstrous ones. The Bible is better for going on the record with God's monstrosity, end quote. This fits with the words of 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, which says, all scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, so that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient and equipped for every good work. We can't just claim that the easy texts that fit our Hallmark or Pottery Barn aesthetic are the ones that have value. The ones that feel more like the spirit of Halloween or Hot Topic need to have their say as well, especially when they are about God. In the next episode, we focus a bit more on God as monster, as well as how different people may resonate not only with Hamori's work, but with different parts of the Bible. I hope you'll join us. Thank you for listening.
Beast and Bible is written, researched, produced, and hosted by Dr. Seth Pierce. Ethan Geck is our editor. Logo design and social media by Chelsea Ernina. Equipment and tech help from the dynamic duo James Gigante and Stephen Husett. Producing and project help from me, Heather Moore. Thanks for listening to Beast and Bible. Tell your friends about us, and don't forget to leave a nightlight on after dark.